Hello, this is Phil Tomzak, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the July 17th issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And let's start with the front page. And the headline is Fear and Frustration as Ontario Wildfires Force Evacuations and Search for Places to Stay. This is written by Amarachi Amadike, staff reporter for the Star. Members of Kiashki-Zaging Anishinabek, also known as Gull Bay First Nation, gathered around a gray van Wednesday morning to collect breakfast vouchers. A short time later, they said goodbye to their homes and headed south. There was little time to spare. The wildfire was coming. The nightmare for the community about 200 kilometers north of Thunder Bay, also known as Gull Bay First Nation, had begun less than 24 hours earlier. That's when residents received a call from Indigenous Services Canada ordering a mandatory evacuation as fires tore through northwestern Ontario. Several other First Nations communities were also forced to evacuate, according to Ontario Provincial Police. Members of Armstrong, White Sand First Nation, and Namaigussisagagun First Nation found refuge in Thunder Bay, having been evacuated early. Gull Bay First Nation community members weren't as fortunate as spaces quickly filled up. There are no accommodations in Thunder Bay, a Gull Bay First Nation news release said Tuesday evening. Hotel rooms are non-existent. For its members, along with members of other affected communities, such as Lac des Mille Lacs First Nation and Gajiwanong Anishinaabe Nation, the alternative was a harrowing journey to Toronto, accompanied by fears that families could be separated. Alternate evacuation locations presented do not facilitate Kiashke-Zaging Anishinabek families to be housed together, stated a subsequent news release. For members of Collins First Nation, however, the situation is grimmer. Chief Helen Pavola told CBC many of her community members fled on boats, watching trees beside their homes get swallowed by roaring flames. Our primary focus is to take care of our community members, as many of our people run out of their houses with only the clothes on their back, Pavola was quoted as saying. Though more spaces eventually became available in Thunder Bay on Wednesday evening, Chief Lawrence Wanakamik, leader of White Sand First Nation, told the Star he's disappointed with the province's response so far. He says his community members began seeking safety before the Ministry of Natural Resources, or the MNR, gave the order. On Monday, White Sand community members eventually took matters into their own hands, launching self-evacuation efforts that continued late into the night. About 475 members are now staying at the Superior Inn in Thunder Bay, hoping they will soon be able to return home if the fire does not reach the community. The winds have shifted, and it seems to be moving away from the community, and there's rain in the forecast, so hopefully that will help. The ministry provided the evacuation order the day after the fire got near, he said, adding that this delay made evacuation efforts less sufficient. As black smoke billowed in the distance, Wanakamik's team contacted MNR, informing the ministry about the pending disaster and seeking guidance. They said to wait, Wanakamik revealed. I'm disappointed in their slow action. MNR spokesman Emily McLaughlin told the Star that the ministry will not spare a single penny to protect the people of Ontario from wildland fires. All of our available aircraft are crewed and supporting wildfire suppression efforts, said McLaughlin, highlighting that the ministry's current fleet of 28 aircraft includes 9 CL-415 heavy water bombers, 8 intermediate helicopters, 6 Twin Otters, and 5 Turbo Beavers, which provide wildland fire suppression and other natural resource and emergency response support. Still, New Democrat MPP Lisa Vergeois, whose riding covers much of the affected area, echoed Wanakamig's concerns, telling the Star that communications surrounding evacuations have been very frustrating. Basically, it got blown off by the Ministry of Emergency Preparedness, saying somebody in each municipality is in charge and to go talk to them, Bourgeois told the Star, noting that her office's phones rang nonstop on Monday with people calling to request help and information. With news that many First Nation families will be left with nothing following this week's disaster, Ontarians took to social media to offer support however they could. Some offered supplies, while others, like Shauna Perry Carson of Peterborough, offered their homes to the evacuees. The people in those communities have lost everything, said Carson, a member of Pick River First Nations. I'm just trying to help people who need it the most. Carson hopes that others will show the same generosity, whether that's offering a room or even just letting people use their backyards to set up tents until everyone has a chance to get to know each other and feel comfortable and safe. They're going to need all the help they can get to rebuild, she added. From what I've heard, Collins is totally gone. And more wildfire news from the GTA in our next article. It has the headline, Was Ontario Prepared for This Wildfire Season? Doug Ford and critics and experts weigh in. And this is written by Emma McIntosh, investigative reporter, and Andy Takagi, transportation reporter for the Star. Excuse me. Orange hues dominated the sky and ash rained down on Toronto for the second day in a row as wildfires continue to spread and rage in northern Ontario. Premier Doug Ford has insisted that his government put its full financial weight behind firefighting efforts, but critics claim the province has lagged in its funding and preparedness for fires that have only gotten worse with climate change. Experts and independent government agency reports point to a much more complicated picture. Larger fires have grown more frequent and damaging than ever before, meaning governments may need to think beyond firefighting on how to manage them. Human beings think that we can outsmart Mother Nature, but some of these fires are incredibly intense, like the ones we are seeing in northern Ontario right now, said Glenn McGillivray, a professor of disaster and emergency management at York University. As of Thursday afternoon, 177 active fires were burning, fueled by a stretch of hot, dry weather and high winds. A few wildfires in northwestern Ontario have also forced evacuations, including one that destroyed homes and buildings on Namaigusasagugun First Nation, north of Thunder Bay, where residents fled the flames without government help. Many of the fires were sparked by lightning. Others have been attributed to human activity, which can include unattended bonfires or power lines. The union representing wildland firefighters, pilots, and operational staff was among those blaming Ford Thursday for understaffing and underfunding firefighting crews. The fact is that Ontario's fire seasons have changed, but our staffing hasn't kept pace, said Jeremy Rouse, the OPSEU chair representing Ministry of Natural Resource employees. We cannot continue to respond to increasingly severe fire seasons with fewer resources than the situation demands, Rouse said. In Toronto, air quality has only gotten worse as smoke from the fires up north billows southward. Soot caked the city Thursday morning, with the Air Quality Health Index peaking at a reading of 30 during the morning rush, more than double yesterday's peak on a scale of 0 to 10 plus. Over the past 3 days, the provincial government has been working closely with Northern Ontario communities, said Nastasia Varela, a spokesperson for Emergency Preparedness Minister Jill Dunlop. This morning, we have also requested the federal government be ready to deploy the Canadian Armed Forces as we work through a fast-moving and evolving situation. Our government's top priority is to keep people safe, Varela said. But is the Ford government doing enough? Ford defended his government's firefighting budget, blasting people on social media who have accused him of cutting it. We would never underfund our firefighters, ever. Never, ever. We've more than doubled the base funding for emergency firefighting, Ford said at a groundbreaking for a hospital in Windsor on Thursday. In his 8 years in office, Ford has upped funding for emergency firefighting, budget documents show, but as was practiced before Ford entered office, that budget is routinely less than what's actually needed to actually put wildfires out. And at the end of the year, the actual amount spent is far higher. That's been the case every year for the past decade, except 2022. The province spent $271 million battling wildfires last year, but the province has budgeted just $135 million. For this year, the province has budgeted $150 million for emergency firefighting. Fire rangers have previously criticized this method of emergency planning and told the Star last year that it can often lead to last-minute scrambles for helicopters and planes that could have been leased in advance. On Thursday, Ford noted his government had earmarked $650 million for 5 new helicopters and 6 water bombers. A spokesperson for Natural Resources Minister Mike Harris said the province has added nearly 170 permanent fire personnel since 2024 and has an existing fleet of over 50 aircraft, including helicopters and water bombers. Wildfires are growing larger and more devastating. Over the past decade, wildfires in Canada have gotten worse. Data from the Canadian National Fire Database shows that there are fewer total fires in Canada, but wildfires are now burning larger than before. According to the Ministry of Natural Resources, Ontario saw 643 wildland fires in 2025, lower than the 10-year average, but saw 597,654 hectares of land burned, an area larger than Prince Edward Island. The growing problem is mostly, but not entirely, fueled by climate change, said Mike Flanagan, a BC research chair at Thompson Rivers University, who specializes in fire science. Fire is natural in the forests that cover most of Ontario, but decades of fire suppression have left many cluttered with fuel that's ready to ignite. Climate change, meanwhile, brings longer, hotter fire seasons. Those warmer temperatures fuel more lightning, which can ignite new fires and suck the moisture out of forests so they burn easily and quickly. This is a new reality, Flanagan said. There's going to be more fire and smoke in the future. Ontario's Ministry of Natural Resources prioritizes fires based on how likely they are to harm people or critical infrastructure, which Flanagan said is one of the best ways to approach it. Sometimes, if a fire poses a low risk, it's best to let it burn, he added. I think the public has this expectation that we can put out all the fires all the time, he said. I don't think that's true, and nor should we. To be honest, we should be letting some of those fires play their natural role. Too little too late. For fires that do pose a risk to communities, extra funding can help efforts to extinguish them. But those resources need to be in place early to tackle new fires while they're still small, Flanagan said. Even when things are extreme, you have a window, he said. Sometimes it's a short window, like 30 minutes. If you get resources to the fire within that 30 minutes, you generally can put it out. At a certain point, however, uncontrolled fires can become too big for crews to control, no matter how much funding is available, said McGillivray, also the managing director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction. The 2024 Jasper fire, for example, was so hot it created its own weather system, with turbulence that made it even more difficult for air tanker crews to battle the flames. The turbulence was so bad that their heads were hitting the sides of the cockpit, McGillivray said. Then, when they dropped their load, it was blowing horizontally back into the fire and evaporating. Instead, governments could better protect communities by making them less flammable, McGillivray said. Simple measures like creating fire breaks and using fire-resistant building materials can make a huge difference. This is not a huge mystery, he said. We know exactly what to do, we just really don't do it. Flanagan said in general, governments need to be more proactive. Experts can predict the weather conditions that lead to new fires, he said, meaning governments could create an early warning system and move resources to high-risk areas before anything ignites. We should ask the question, as Canadians, is the status quo the best option? Flanagan asked. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And let's move on to another fire-related story coming from the world of music. And this has the headlines, "As Toronto summers get hotter, concert organizers face new hurdles in keeping fans cool and safe." And this is written by David Friend, culture reporter for the Star. Another week of record-breaking heat and poor air quality hasn't kept thousands of music fans from attending outdoor concerts across the city. RBC Amphitheater hosted Jack White on Tuesday as the Humidex climbed toward 40 centigrade, while rock band Muse took the stage Wednesday despite hot, hazy conditions caused by wildfire smoke from northern Ontario that pushed the Air Quality Health Index into the high-risk category. On Friday, the amphitheater will host electronic music producer Chris Lake. Aaron Cockburn has spent years dancing through Toronto's sweltering summer concerts, but lately the intense heat has made the Oakville resident rethink how he prepares for show days. After seeing stories about fans collapsing from dehydration at past local shows, Cockburn started wearing a hat, applying sunscreen, and carrying a reusable water bottle. He believes concert venues have also stepped up efforts to keep fans safe. "Free water stations are absolutely everywhere now," said Cockburn, 28. "It seems like organizers realize that people passing out isn't good for the rest of the show." The risks of intense heat, the physical dangers of heat exposure at concerts are clear, said Glenn Kenny, a physiology professor at the University of Ottawa. "The biggest harmful effect is the lack of airflow because you've got so many people compressed together that are generating heat," said Kenny, adding that the city center is about 7 to 10 degrees hotter on a summer day than the outskirts. For good evaporative cooling, you need people's bodies exposed. But then you've got people dancing around. They're putting themselves at risk by being more active and engaged. Kenny is skeptical that misting stations or portable fans offer much protection. Air temperature above 33 degrees Celsius is not going to be lowered by the use of fans, he said. It makes you feel better, but it doesn't reduce the risk. Sheena Sharp, a principal at Cool Earth Architecture, argues that fans and misting stations are not the answer. "Any solution we come up with is either half-arsed or it's so terribly expensive that concert ticket prices will be sky high," she said. "We're trying to fix stuff with technology, and we're starting to hit a point where that is not going to work." How Toronto venues are addressing the heat. Some Toronto venues already have features in place to keep concertgoers cool, including two of the largest outdoor spaces. RBC Amphitheater sits on the shore of Lake Ontario, where cooler evening air helps moderate temperatures around the time concerts usually begin. A Live Nation spokesperson said the 16,000-capacity venue has allowed concertgoers to bring empty, refillable water bottles for more than a decade and provides free drinking water at 3 refill stations throughout the grounds. Rogers Stadium, which is now dormant for a month, also increased the availability of free water at its 50,000-person venue following feedback last summer. There are now more than 30 stations both inside the premises and outside the gates, according to a representative. Its operators have also added more trees to the asphalt surrounding the venue to shade ticket holders before the show. For smaller events, however, the challenge is often logistical. The Toronto Jazz Festival narrowly avoided last month's prolonged heat wave. "The response is not to take concerts away," said Josh Grossman, the artistic director at the Toronto Downtown Jazz Society, which produces the festival. It's to make people as comfortable as possible while they're enjoying this experience unique to the summer. In past years, the festival has hosted a water station provided by the City of Toronto, but this year they didn't. It was more a space issue than anything, said Grossman. If we don't adapt, it won't be sustainable. Sergio Emilio Parra, research and program manager at the Canadian Live Music Association, said climate change is one of the most serious challenges facing festivals across Canada. A recent survey of their 300 members found that 83% believe climate change is affecting their events, with 87% expecting those disruptions to grow over the next 5 years. Everybody is doing what they can with what they have, said Parra. It's a very diverse industry that ranges from multinationals that have all the resources to smaller indie operators that cannot devote much of their time and resources to this issue. Parra sees potential in corporate partnerships to help fund cooling measures, but warns the status quo is increasingly fragile. If we don't adapt, it won't be sustainable for our industry, unfortunately, he said. We might see major disruptions. We're talking about festivals shutting down, venues shutting down. Now here's some expert tips for summer concert going. Physiology professor Glenn Kenny shares his tips for summer concert going in Toronto. Number 1, take a seat. While performers love it when a crowd gets on their feet, Kenny suggests it's smarter to sit down when the heat is on. The issue is that when you're standing upright, blood is moving down to your feet, and what your body really needs is warm blood traveling to the surface of your skin where heat can more easily escape into the air. Anybody standing for long periods of time in hot environments is going to potentially succumb to the effects of heat stress, he said. Number 2, wear a hat. When our skin surface is directly in contact with solar radiation, that becomes problematic, said Kenny. The sun beaming down on you is going to heat the body up fast. Number 3, find some space. Try to distance yourself from other people since they are also generating heat. Cramped quarters are a recipe for extreme danger, Kenny said. When I was 16, I'd be right at the front. Now you'll see me further back where I get adequate airflow. And number 4, water won't solve everything. Staying hydrated at outdoor events is crucial because it maintains sweat output. But the process should not begin in the middle of a concert. Drink water before you head to the show, and be aware that your body and mind will play little tricks on you. Your thirst sensation never keeps up with the rate at which you dehydrate, Kenny said. Your gut will fill up, but it's still not enough, so you're always behind the 8 ball. Alcohol and caffeinated drinks aren't helpful either, he said. Certainly you'll get hydrated, but there are other side effects that are going to put you at greater risk at developing heat stress. And finally, number 5, use a buddy system. Kenny suggests working out a system of checking in with friends, especially if they're consuming alcohol or moving around to the beat. If a loved one starts to realize you are not responding the same way, that's a good sign you're showing signs of heat-related disorders, he said. Let's move on to the subject of sports from the Blue Jays, and this article has the headline, "The Blue Jays' direction at the trade deadline and beyond will be decided in the next 2 weeks." And this comes from Gregor Chisholm, baseball columnist for the Star. The Blue Jays spent the entire first half waiting for the magic of last year's World Series run to reappear. They exit the All-Star break knowing their clock is about to expire. With the August 3rd trade deadline looming, the next 2 weeks will determine the Jays' fate. Win, and this team will stick together, while possibly adding an upgrade or two for the stretch run. Lose, and this era of Jays baseball is over. The Jays open the second half Friday night against the Chicago White Sox, sitting in the American League East basement. The good news is they are just 2.5 games back of the final wildcard spot. The bad news is they must leapfrog 5 teams to get there. The decision to buy at last year's deadline was a no-brainer when the Jays had the best record in the division. The push to sell in 2024 was equally straightforward for a last-place team that exited the break 7 games below 500 and trailed the wild card by 8.5 games. This year's team is 6 games under, and yet the next steps remain unclear because the season could still go either way. Buying, at a minimum, would require targeting a right-handed hitting platoon option for the outfield and another high-leverage arm for the bullpen. The Jays also desperately need another middle-of-the-order bat, although one might not be available. If the lineup isn't going to improve, the starting 5 needs to be almost flawless. The Jays currently feature Dylan Cease, Kevin Gausman, Trey Yesavage, and Shane Bieber, but it's doubtful the injured Max Scherzer will have much success as the missing 5th piece. They require another reliable arm. If the Jays were to sell, they won't be getting as much in return as they did 2 years ago. The Jays used that deadline to quickly retool by trading away a slew of veterans on expiring deals, including left-hander Yusei Kikuchi, catcher Danny Jansen, and reliever Yimi Garcia. They also moved infielder Isaiah Kinner-Falefa and right-hander Nate Pearson. The flurry of activity injected some much-needed youth into the organization. Jonathan Claes, Yohendrick Pinango, and Charles McAdoo were part of the return. Infielder Will Wagner was used to acquire catcher Brandon Valenzuela. Right-hander Jake Bloss and outfielder R.J. Schreck are among those still in the minors. A sell-off this year wouldn't be as fruitful. Gausman could be shopped, but it makes just as much sense to hang on to the veteran starter and re-sign him during the off-season. Bieber has limited trade value until he shows noticeable improvement. The position player side isn't any better. George Springer is a pending free agent and a logical trade candidate, but a suitor would have first to swallow his ugly .677 OPS. Jesus Sanchez's market is limited at best. The only tradable reliever is Jeff Hoffman. Teams will covet his 13.9 strikeouts per 9 innings, but few would willingly take on his $11 million U.S. salary for 2027. Toronto would have to foot the bill to buy a decent prospect. If the Jays continue to tread water out of the break, there's also a chance the front office won't do anything. They would instead bank on a bounce back from Vladimir Guerrero Jr., and continued improvement from Bieber and the eventual return of Addison Barger to upgrade the lineup. Staying pat would help ensure fans who bought tickets for the second half aren't watching entirely meaningless baseball down the stretch. Ultimately, though, it's unlikely to lead to better results from a clearly flawed roster. Guerrero's improvement is vital, but he cannot carry this stagnant offense alone. The pitching staff, which started to falter before the All-Star break, could be in trouble too. Bieber still doesn't look like himself, Yesavage has been inconsistent, and Spencer Miles is running out of innings. Beyond Bloss, there isn't much depth in the minors to protect against more injuries. Expect the front office to take every available minute before choosing a path. General Manager Ross Atkins doesn't want to spend prospect capital only to see the season fall apart. He also doesn't want to anger a fan base by waving the white flag too early on a team that nearly won it all a year ago. The clock is ticking, and the Jays will be tested in the next week with a pair of series against the AL Central leading White Sox and the AL East leading Tampa Bay Rays. Then the roster will have matchups against Washington, Boston, and St. Louis to prove it's worthy of remaining intact. The postseason still might be nearly 3 months away, but for this iteration of the Jays, October essentially begins Friday night. Buy, sell, or stick with the status quo, the decision won't just define the deadline, it will declare whether this chapter of Blue Jays baseball remains ongoing or is officially over. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. And let's move on now to a contributor's opinion piece. It has the title, "There's Something Just as Threatening to the Fabric of Canadian Society as Donald Trump's America." And this comes from Amira El-Gawabi, a contributor. Excuse me. Many in Canada have never been prouder to be Canadian. A new poll by Politico found that 52% of us now consider ourselves very proud of our nationality, up from just 34% in December 2024. The cause isn't a mystery. U.S. President Donald Trump's tariffs and talk of the 51st state did what a decade of domestic politics couldn't. Elbows up isn't just a hockey term anymore. It's both political strategy and national mood. But defiance only means something if it's in service of the values we believe our country stands for. The same poll carries a warning. Despite growing pride, more than half of Canadians say their country is internally divided. In part, this is ordinary friction that can manifest in standard bickering and disagreements. But there are also darker trends to be aware of. Weeks ago, a man with a rifle and a lengthy manifesto opened fire in Côte-des-Neiges, Montreal, killing a Muslim police officer and a Jewish bystander. Researchers have described the ideas expressed as a form of hybrid extremism, misogyny at its foundation, anti-capitalist grievance, and anti-Semitic conspiracy layered on top. It fits no ideology, which makes it easy to treat as an aberration rather than a warning. But these undercurrents are among the threats we face and the dangers we must collectively guard against. A Senate report found that between 2016 and 2021, Canada recorded more Islamophobic killings than any other G7 country. A rise in the attacks. Add to that shocking fact the rise in attacks on Jewish institutions, frequent assaults on visibly Muslim women and families in neighborhoods and near places of worship, vandalism at mosques and synagogues, and hate crimes targeting people for their race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. It's never been more critical to resist becoming comfortable treating hatred as background noise rather than as the human rights emergency it is. We may perceive indifference as a uniquely American phenomenon. An opinion poll with the Concordia Forum found nearly 4 in 10 American Muslims change their routines over fears of anti-Muslim hate, and only 1 in 5 say they are treated equally under U.S. law. But here at home, Canada's own push for more restrictive immigration rules has opened space for the kind of nativist sentiment Canadians long considered as existing elsewhere. Recently, the Environics Institute found that 1 in 3 Canadians feel wholly negative about immigration, all while a majority of racialized Canadians said they value both their race and ethnicity and their Canadianness. Believing in a country and being treated fairly by it are not the same thing anywhere. Ottawa has recently advanced sweeping border legislation, including expanded powers for border agencies, faster deportation, and new authority to share personal data with U.S. immigration enforcement. Civil liberties groups warn that this information sharing could give U.S. agencies, including ICE, a way to track people who came to Canada for protection. And finally, rights protections. Together, these moves risk putting rights protections in the box. Ottawa's defense is that this is about controlling Canada's border, not appeasing Trump. That may be true. Handling migration and border security is a legitimate job for any government. But doing so by reaching for Washington's toolkit while calling it a Canadian solution isn't the same as doing it in a way that's true to Canadian values. Trump doesn't need Canada to become the 51st state for his politics to win. He needs something easier, a country drifting toward the America he is building, anxious, suspicious of newcomers, willing to trade rights for the feeling of control. Canadians may be united against Trump, but sovereignty isn't only about keeping his politics out. It's about proving that what's inside is distinct and worth protecting. Trump is not the only test of Canadian values right now. He may not even be the hardest one. And on to our next article. It's a Star exclusive, and it has the headline, The public must pay sex offenders $50,000 legal tab due to deliberately uncooperative Toronto cop, a judge rules. And this comes from Jacques Gallant, courts and justice reporter for the Star. Pardon me. A judge has ordered that the public pick up a convicted sex offender's $50,000 legal tab due to delayed disclosure of records by Toronto police and the deliberately uncooperative detective in charge of the case. Superior Court Justice Gillian Roberts took the rare step of ordering costs against the Crown, the provincial government, last month, in the case of a man who, after accusing his partner of cheating, ripped off her pants, attempted to penetrate her digitally, and tried to shove her tampon in her mouth while threatening to kill her. The Star isn't naming the man, who was convicted of aggravated sexual assault, as it could lead to the identification of the victim, whose name is covered by a standard publication ban. At issue were records regarding the exact whereabouts and handling of the man's phone while it was in police custody following his March 2023 arrest, as the defense at one point had what Roberts called a good faith concern that the phone may have been improperly accessed. In the end, there was no improper access. After making repeated requests for the records, the defense was forced to schedule a disclosure hearing last September, more than 2 years after the phone was taken, so that the court could order access to the records. Some were finally released at the hearing. And still more came out this past April at a hearing where the defense asked Roberts to stay the proceedings for abuse of process. The judge declined in her decision last month, instead ordering that the Crown pay $50,000, an estimate of what the defense had to spend trying to get the records, including preparing for the court hearings. None of these costs should have been necessary, Roberts said. The judge said the delays were manifestly inappropriate, finding that the defense had to go to extraordinary efforts and spend enormous resources to get basic information about the phone. She primarily laid the blame at the feet of the officer in charge, the OIC, of the case, Detective Matthew Whiten. Some of his emails regarding the phone were finally disclosed at the September disclosure hearing, but inexplicably some were not and only came out at the April stay hearing. Roberts was concerned with Whiten's testimony at both hearings. It's hard to conclude anything other than Detective Whiten was being deliberately uncooperative and unhelpful, the judge wrote. During the stay application, Detective Whiten repeatedly purported not to understand what was being asked. When the question was rephrased or asked again, he repeatedly could not recall. Let's move on now next to the life section. And this is a favorite. Let's ask Lisi. And the headline for today's Ask Lisi column is, I'm newly divorced. My wife threw a hot divorcee rager. She looks amazing. Did I screw up? Let's ask Lisi. And this comes from Lisi Tesher, advice columnist. And the question from the reader, my ex-wife and I recently divorced. Our marriage has simply run its course. I wasn't in love with her anymore, and I didn't really like her all that much either. We had a whirlwind love affair and married after only 2 years from when we first met. We got pregnant quickly, but lost the baby. We lost another before having our son. We lost 2 more before we finally had our second son, who was born with disabilities. My ex put her everything into our children, and she has done a wonderful job. But I guess our marriage suffered as a result. We separated 18 months ago, and we've been divorced for 3 months. Last week, my wife hosted a hot divorcee party that was apparently a rager. All our mutual friends were in attendance, including a few of my single friends. According to what I'm hearing, my ex looks fabulous and has never been happier. She was smiling and laughing all night, and, according to one of my married friends, was being hit on by multiple guys throughout the night. Did I make the biggest mistake of my life? Signed, Wrong Turn. And Lisi's answer, from your description, your wife has been through a lot, physically and emotionally. pregnant 6 times and losing 4 babies takes a huge toll on your body and your emotional well-being. The hormone roller coaster your wife has been on over the course of that time alone would make anyone uneven. Were you there for her during her downs as well as her ups? Were you an equal parenting partner? Did you help her navigate whatever systems were needed for your son with disabilities? Or did you allow her to suffer on her own and then felt she was no longer a worthy wife? Marriages usually start out happy between 2 people who are in love and enjoy being together. But then life happens. Work-related issues, family issues, financial stress, conception and pregnancy troubles, children, and people change. They fall into patterns and they lose a bit of themselves. Your wife sounds as though she's shed some of her unhappiness and is finding herself again. Did you make a mistake by ending your marriage? Maybe, but I'd suggest giving it some more time before attempting a reconciliation. And let's move on to our second letter to Lisi. And the question from the reader: my cousin is insufferable and talks about her life nonstop. Her husband made a lot of money and now they live quite the high lifestyle, vacationing often, staying at posh hotels and resorts, going out for expensive meals, paying big money for high-value tickets to concerts and sport events. I'm happy for her as she didn't have a lot growing up and neither did her husband when they first married. But what I don't like is the bragging with a hint of humility. And I'm also annoyed she never invites me to anything she brags about. How long do I have to listen to this? Signed, Catty Cousin. And Lisi's answer: you don't. But before you ghost her, tell her how you feel. Tell her you're happy for her newfound wealth. But to call you and brag, then feign humility, and never include you is cruel. I can't imagine ever doing that to anyone. Then tell her that this isn't the type of friendship you'd like to continue, even if she is your cousin. Wish her well and get back to your own life. Let's move on now to an article from the travel section. Chronic pain once limited my wife to 1,000 steps a day, but our dream hiking trip in England tested her recovery. And this is by Adrian Ma, a special to the Star. My wife Elizabeth and I share a love of classic English romantic dramas, Bronte novels, Jane Austen adaptations, and Bridgerton. For years, we imagined roaming together through the idyllic English countryside, doing our best Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth Bennet impressions. But for most of our relationship, the roaming part never felt possible. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth has lived with chronic pain, particularly in her right knee. It came on without warning in her early 20s, shortly before we met. Doctors struggled to identify a physical cause. Treatments brought little improvement. During the worst flare-ups, which could last weeks at a time, she had to ration her steps to fewer than 1,000 a day, a limit that felt especially unreasonable once we had 2 children. For Elizabeth, who grew up hiking in the Rockies and climbing trees, this was devastating. My world became very small, she said. A few years ago, however, my wife finally found something that helped: pain reprocessing therapy. In Elizabeth's case, her nervous system had become highly sensitized. A typical twinge or ache would register as debilitatingly painful, even when doctors couldn't find evidence of ongoing damage. Through PRT, she began learning how to quiet that alarm response and slowly trust her body again. She started moving more. Short neighborhood strolls became hour-long jaunts through city parks. Her body regained strength and stability, but the greater challenge was emotional, learning not to fear every flicker of soreness as foreshadowing that her body would let her down again. In early 2026, we decided we would roll the dice on the trip we thought could only be a dream, hiking in England's famed Peak District, that rugged region of windswept moors and sweeping valleys that has inspired generations of wordsmiths and artists. It would be the greatest test of Elizabeth's recovery so far. Our mission was Shining Tor, a hill in Peak District National Park. At 559 meters above sea level, it's the highest point in the county of Cheshire and a popular destination for walkers on the western edge of the park. We stayed at the Swan Inn, a village pub in Kettleshulme, about an hour from Manchester. Built in the early 18th century, the inn charmed us immediately with its whitewashed walls, climbing plants, and cozy garden patio, where locals spent the afternoons nursing pints of bitter. It also offered a convenient location. From the front door, we could walk to the start of the trail near Pim Chair Car Park with no need to drive. There are a variety of routes to Shining Tor, including ones with more expansive views of the Goyt Valley, but we opted for a more direct, modestly challenging path that would take us from the inn, past the Windgather Rocks cliffside, up the smaller Cat's Tor, and finally up to the hill's summit. From start to finish, we would cover nearly 14 kilometers over about 4 hours of continuous walking, easily the longest trek of Elizabeth's life. By no means was this Kilimanjaro, but when you're in pain, every hill looks like a mountain, Elizabeth told me. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Let's continue our travel article now. The morning of the trek, as we put on our hiking shoes, Elizabeth looked at me with a half smile. I could sense her anxiety. "My knee is angry," she said. Despite all the strides she has made, the old doubts were still there. Her eyes welled up. "Are you sure?" I asked. "It's okay if you don't want to do this anymore." But she nodded. "I'm sure. I'm going to do this." With that, we stepped out of the pub and straight into the pastoral landscape. It was a balmy June day, overcast but pleasant. We walked along old stone walls and farmers' fields, where sheep eyed us warily as they chewed their grass. We scrambled up to Windgather Rocks, a jagged line of gritstone crags overlooking the rolling fields. As we climbed higher, the air cooled and the path grew rockier, wildflowers blooming in purple and blue along the edges. In my imagination, we had always spent the hike in erudite banter, like a couple of Regency characters. Instead, we said very little, the rhythmic crunch of our shoes on the gravelly path providing most of the soundtrack. A couple of hours in, Elizabeth remained steadfast. Despite her earlier uncertainty, her body was holding up well. But she had been quiet for much of the ascent. "What's going through your mind?" I finally asked. She thought for a moment. "Everyone who helped me keep going when I could barely move," she said. "My parents, your parents, our friends, our kids. You. How grateful and lucky I am." 10 minutes from the summit, the clouds darkened. A sudden downpour cascaded over us. We tightened our jackets, put our heads down, and kept moving. After a final push, I saw the concrete trig point, which marked our arrival at the hill's peak. But this was Elizabeth's moment. "You're almost there," I shouted. Reaching the trig point, she placed her hand on top of it and broke into a full smile. We took in the panorama around us. Green folds of grassland, ridges and dales, stretching as far as we could see. I enveloped her in a hug, asking how she felt. "Accomplished," she said, "and relieved. I didn't know if my body would let me get here, but I wasn't going to stop." Then she smiled again. "I'm also very much looking forward to a bath and a pint." As we began our descent, the rain stopped and the sun emerged for the first time all day, casting the countryside in a luminous glow. We walked back down, side by side, ready for the next mountain. Let's move on to the world of entertainment, arts, and culture. And we have a movie review. The Odyssey is a dazzling blockbuster. It's also the purest expression of this one Christopher Nolan fixation. This is by Peter Howell as a special to the Star. Much is said in Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey about Zeus's law, the ancient Greek code of conduct requiring strangers to be treated with respect and hospitality. Violations of the decree by humans and monsters fuel much of the drama in this transfixing adaptation of Homer's epic poem, a spectacle of magic, devotion, crushing pain, and extreme brawn set 3,000 years ago. It's the blockbuster of the summer. Yet Nolan's law, to coin a phrase, is a more powerful edict. Witnessed in action but not discussed on screen, it's the writer-director's self-imposed dogma of making films with male protagonists, a curious, career-long fascination that reaches a peak with The Odyssey, his 13th feature. The film feels like the purest expression of that fixation. Nolan steadfastly chooses for his lead characters mission-driven men whose identities are defined by guilt, responsibility, and loss, usually at the expense of intimacy, friendship, and ordinary emotional life. These are men propelled by duty and haunted by consequence, moving through stories structured as quests, races against time, or acts of survival. This preference is frequently noted by critics, although the filmmaker rarely addresses it directly in interviews, preferring to discuss technical processes in his work, such as cameras and film formats, and his predilection for practical rather than computer-generated effects. Much speculation ensues about his motives. Does he prefer to write and film stories about men, or is he just not that interested in female-led narratives? Attempts to reach him for a comment via his publicist came to naught. Nolan's male leads are frequently damaged and alone, their wives or lovers often dead or at risk. His films habitually fail the Bechdel test, the one that requires 2 or more female characters to be in a scene talking about anything other than men, a shortcoming that remains evident in The Odyssey despite its large female ensemble. In Nolan's first feature, Following, a mystery thriller released in 1998, his lead character is identified as the young man, but his female support is called merely the blonde. The tenets of Nolan's law. The hyper-masculine protagonists of Nolan's law are usually a combination of hero and anti-hero. Think of the vengeful widower of Memento, the vigilante caped crime fighter from the Batman trilogy, the astronaut farmer of Interstellar, the CIA operative of Tenet, called merely the protagonist, the stoic soldiers of Dunkirk, the atomic bomb builder of Oppenheimer, and now the savage archer and warrior Odysseus in The Odyssey, played with macho vigor by Matt Damon. As lethal with commands as he is with his arrows, Odysseus leads his men with arrogance and authority, first during the protracted Trojan War, and later in a fateful return voyage to their loved ones in the island kingdom of Ithaca, while battling monsters and risking wrath of the gods. Nolan recently told the Los Angeles Times he considers The Odyssey to be a summation of his work in cinema. "I've been telling this story in all my films for years," he says. "It's a family story, a love story, a revenge story, a war story, a coming-of-age story. It's a very strong foundational text for me." Foundational text are the operative words. Nolan is drawn to Homer's classic tale in large part because of its clear masculine identity. He loves stories about men who are capable of both good and bad. Yet bad, in Nolan's world, usually doesn't include risque sexual activity. His films, with the exception of the Oscar-winning Oppenheimer, are also notable for being chaste in the bedroom. Even when desire is present, it is subordinate to duty and ambition. It would be almost unthinkable of Nolan to make a show like TV's Heated Rivalry, where the hockey stars played by Hudson Williams and Connor Story are as horny as tomcats, while also being emotionally bonded. In fairness to Nolan, he's put many strong female characters into his films, Anne Hathaway's roles being first and foremost among them. She's played Selena Catwoman in The Dark Knight Rises, scientist astronaut Amelia Brand in Interstellar, and her grandest Nolan role of all, stoic wife Penelope in the Odyssey. Penelope is obliged to maintain order in Ithaca during the long absence of Odysseus, all the while fighting off would-be suitors, including particularly demanding ones played by Robert Pattinson and Corey Hawkins, who are literally living in her home as per the hospitality dictum of Zeus's law. The Odyssey may have a feast of female roles, but their narrative prominence varies sharply. Besides Hathaway, there's Lupita Nyong'o in the dual role of legendary beauty Helen of Troy, whose abduction-elopement sparks the Trojan War, and Clytemnestra, the scheming spouse of Trojan War commander Agamemnon, played by Benny Safdie. Other standout female roles are Zendaya as the goddess Athena, Samantha Morton as the witch goddess Circe, Charlize Theron as the entrancing nymph Calypso, and Mia Goth as Penelope's sketchy maid Melantho. Yet these characters don't get anywhere near the screen time as Damon's Odysseus or Tom Holland's Telemachus, whose story as the rising heir to the Ithacan throne runs parallel to the main narrative. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the July 17th issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Phil Tomczak. Thank you for listening.